Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Why does it take tragic events like Charlottesville to get the national news media to focus on issues of racism, the rise of hate groups, and white rage? What did you think of this video from Vice? Vice got right in the faces of the white nationalists, neo-Nazi, the KKK members on the campus of UVA back 9 days ago, that Friday night. This video, so vivid, you heard the hateful chants up close and personally, became a viral sensation on YouTube, on Facebook, attracting millions of views. It was all over television because Vice's cameras went there and got right in the center of it all. When is that harmful and when is that helpful? Let's talk through these issues with two people who think a lot about these topics. Nicole Hannah-Jones, a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine who covers race in the United States, and Tanzina Vega, CNN national reporter for race and inequality. I wanted to start, Nicole, with the Vice video because it was so raw and shocking. We thought we had seen everything from Charlottesville, but then we saw that Vice documentary. Is it ever harmful, you think, to be giving these racists a platform like that, or is it helpful in the case of something like Vice?
It's an interesting question. I think that it is important for us to see what is actually happening and what's out there, and that ignoring it allows us to pretend that there hasn't always been large numbers of people who believe in the things that were exposed in that video.
But there's a lot of denialism, you think, going on until you see it in that kind of footage?
Absolutely. I think that while I work in print can be very powerful, but to actually see people, to hear them in their own words, to see kind of how sinister it all was, I think that there's nothing like that, particularly for people like myself and Tanzina, who have been working for years to say that this undercurrent of racism has never gone away. There's no way that you can deny it when you see something like the Vice documentary.
When you see it. Tanzina, you used to work at the Times. Now you're here at CNN. You've spoken a lot about media diversity and how it's exhausting to have the same conversations over and over again about diversity in newsrooms without seeing measurable change. Was this week an example of that to you, that all of a sudden there were conversations all over TV about race when they're not usually happening?
Absolutely, and I think to the point that you made, that Nicole was making earlier, ignoring this type of hate and ignoring this type of bigotry isn't something that people of color and marginalized communities have the luxury to do. You know, even the morning of Charlottesville, I think we were seeing people saying, oh, let's just ignore this. This is, you know, these are hate-filled people. When you're the victim, or when you're the intended target of groups like that, it's not something that you can just say, you know what, I'm not going to pay any mind to that. So I think as individuals, we don't have the luxury to do that, and as journalists, we shouldn't either. And I think what we're seeing is that race is often treated as something that's a trend. It's something where you see journalists in newsrooms and editors saying, oh my God, you know, we've got a Nazi rally, we've got, you know, Black Lives Matter, we've got to jump on this now, when it's not a trend. Race is something that people live every day, and we have to treat it as a part of a fabric of our society.
So Nicole, if newsrooms were appropriately diverse, if there were proportional numbers of minorities working in television and print newsrooms, would that be the case? Would it be treated like a trend?
Well,
I suspect,
maybe not.
I suspect race would be. I suspect race would be covered more fully if there were more newsrooms led by black or black women, for example, like Lydia Polgren at the Huffington Post.
So that's a different question, right? So you have the issue of staffing, and do staffs represent the demographics of the country? And absolutely they do not. And if you have a more diverse staff, you have greater potential that these stories will be covered. But we also know, working in newsrooms where often you have journalists of color who are pushing these stories and are not allowed to tell them. So what's also important is that the leadership...
What do you mean not allowed to tell them? Because the top bosses in the newsrooms don't want to hear it? What do you mean?
Often it's thought that this is a niche story, that this is a story that only affects small numbers of Americans, or even a disbelief that there actually is a story. I mean, you think about all of a sudden the reporting that you saw on police violence. Well, journalists of color who've lived in Black and brown communities have long known that police violence was an issue. But oftentimes you're not able to tell those stories because white editors don't think that these are actual stories. So I think diversity has to also be at the top. Who's running the newsrooms, who are actually approving stories, and then where are those stories being placed either on television or in the newspaper.
And there's also the question of the assumption of bias, right? I think a lot of times when I get interviewed about what I cover, and I'm sure, Nicole, you deal with this too, it's like, can you be objective covering race, as a woman of color? And the question here is not, this is journalism that we do, right? But we also have standards for what in this country we consider right or wrong. And I think the Society of Professional Journalists might have released some guidance this week on that. It's okay to call out discrimination. That's part of what we do as journalists, right? So this idea that if we're calling out racism, that makes us biased and that it makes our reporting even less valid, I think that's something that newsroom managers really have to pay attention to.
I didn't think I was biased when I was doing a podcast about white Christian America.
Correct.
But you're saying that sometimes blacks or Hispanics in newsrooms feel like they're being questioned about their biases.
Right, and I've actually been asked that question repeatedly whenever I've been interviewed about my beat. Tanzina, can you cover this, without bias? And I ask people exactly that, do we question, white men perhaps who are covering issues related to white men?
Right.
I mean, we need to think about that.
Race at all, right? I mean, the notion that the only people who experience race in this country are people of color and who report through the lens of race are people of color is, of course, absurd. I mean, white Americans experience race as well. And the reporting, what they choose to cover or not to cover, is heavily influenced by how they've experienced race in this country.
I was just looking on spj.org. That Society of Professional Journalists guidance is really interesting on spj.org. Was this a PR move by James Murdoch? He's the CEO of 21st Century Fox. He's a son of Rupert Murdoch. He wrote a letter this week that said in part, "What we watched in Charlottesville and the reaction to it by the President of the United States concerns all of us as Americans and free people." Now, James Murdoch didn't stop there. He kept going. He said, "To further demonstrate our commitment, my wife Catherine and I are donating $1 million to the Anti-Defamation League. And I encourage you," he said to colleagues, "to give what you think is right as well." Now, James Murdoch said that his business, 21st Century Fox, has tried to contribute to a diverse and tolerant society. Some folks who think Fox News has an adverse effect on society cracked up at that sentence. What does James Murdoch mean when he's donating $1 million to the ADL? Does it tell us anything about Fox News? Back with me, Tanzina Vega and Nicole Hannah-Jones. I wonder, Tanzina, your interpretation of this. I mean, what viewers of Fox News, loyal viewers of Fox, are hearing about Charlottesville and about the president's reaction is very different than what's been heard in the rest of the press.
So I think there's two things to think about here. Number one, we're seeing a lot more corporate involvement and corporate condemnation of this president and of everything that the comments that he made and the lack of
this was James Murdoch's way of doing that,
That's right. That's right. So we've seen companies pulling out. We've seen all of this. So this is another, step in that equation. I think what's interesting is that obviously Fox is underneath that. I think what's interesting would be to ask journalists of color working at Fox how they take this. Journalists that are from different groups that are working at this organization. What's happening behind the scenes there? I think it sends a very strong message, but obviously we want to see, does that trickle down to the content?
There is a significant discrimination suit against Fox that's pending right now. We also heard from the CEO of Univision this week, another media company, in this case Randy Falco, the head of Univision, making a pretty big stand against the president. I think in that case speaking on behalf of Hispanic viewers of Univision, Spanish-speaking viewers in the United States. Nicole, do you think that it's appropriate to see media CEOs weighing in like that? We've seen a lot of CEOs speaking out, but media CEOs takes it to a different place.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an opinion on that I'm going to express. I think that...
It's an unusual answer on cable news, and I actually really appreciate that.
I think in general, we are brought up as journalists, not to tell our viewers or our readers our opinions. And I think in general, that's a good practice, but I'm not going to comment on that.
But when does that change? I mean, Jake Tapper has said something recently that stood out to me. He said, yes, we keep our opinions in many cases to ourselves, but on issues of decency and facts, that's when journalists have to speak out.
Well, and I agree, and I think that's the difference. When we're talking about what this president has said and done, that's exactly the reporting that Carl Bernstein was referring to earlier in the show, right? We're doing reporting based on what he says, and we're doing reporting based on what he doesn't say, and we're doing reporting based on his policies. So anybody that's been following the policies of the administration can tell you, not just the rhetoric, but the actual policies that are being implemented or that are attempting to be implemented, the Muslim ban, the language around Mexican immigrants, the language around criminal aliens. So all of this is leading up to actual reporting and taking away what this president means.
More stories to tell.
Right.
Thank you to both for being here.
I've been